up. Welcome everybody. Today's webinar super about the panel that we have today, especially Kyle. Patrick is so, but especially Kyle is a huge honor to have. So here's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna keep it pretty straightforward, like like we try on all webinars. We're gonna do a little intro so you guys know the context of the people that are in the webinar today. Patrick, who's like the master of the universe when it comes to pricing and pricing strategy and has all the data in SaaS in his pocket. He's going to share a bit of data and information from kind of all what's going on in the SaaS industry in general and when it comes to pricing. And then we're going to go into the panel session. Throughout the entire time, here's what I encourage everybody to do. Please ask your questions at any point in time that a question pop up in your mind. Use the Q&A button. Please don't use the chat, right? Please use the Q&A button to write in your question. And at the second half of the webinar, we're going to go through all your questions and trying to address this. This webinar is just like entrepreneurship in general. You're going to get as much out of it as you proactively engage, right? So if you don't ask questions, if you don't engage in the conversation, this might be mildly entertaining, better than what YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook have to offer. But if you really engage with us, you ask questions about your business model, your pricing, your sales pricing challenges, then hopefully this webinar can truly make an impact in your results. So please use the Q&A button to ask your questions. When you ask your questions in chat, it's just too much activity. And at the end of the webinar, when we want to go to the Q&A section, I'm not going to be able to find and fish out your questions from there. So use the chat to tell us where you are from around the world, but please use the Q&A button to ask your question throughout the webinar. Without further ado, let's start with you, Patrick. Give us a quick intro on who you are and your background. We'll go to Kyle and myself, and then we'll rock and roll with the webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. Patrick Campbell here. I'm the founder CEO of a company called ProfitWell. We're also the makers of, more relevant today, Price Intelligently, which helps SaaS and subscription companies using data, software, and a bunch of fun magic, we'll call it, basically get their pricing right using data.
Sweet. Kyle, want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, hi everyone, Kyle Poyer here. I'm Senior Director of Market Strategy at OpenView. OpenView is an expansion stage venture capital firm investing in B2B SaaS companies, and I work with our portfolio on growth strategies and a lot of pricing and monetization work.
Sweet. You guys see a beautiful picture of a gentleman called Ryan Robinson. He's the mastermind behind this webinar. He put together everything. He made this space happen, made sure that Kyle and Patrick are here on time, made sure I'm here on time, and invited all of you to participate. So big shout out to Ryan. Yeah, he's going to be masterminding things and monitoring the chat and Q&A section in the background. So thanks, Ryan, for all your awesome work. A little intro on myself. Stel Yefty. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Close.io. We're an inside sales CRM that helps startups and SMBs close more deals and make more revenue. So we deeply care about sales. We deeply care about empowering sales team to do better. And one of my biggest pet peeves for people that know me is some of the pricing mistakes that startups make and some of the negotiation pricing, mistakes that salespeople make. So hopefully we'll unpack some of that and we'll give you guys better strategies to succeed in sales, especially with the focus on pricing today. So with that being said, today we're going to do something unusual because we have such an amazing guest with Patrick, and since Patrick has access to such incredible data, we're actually going to give it up to Patrick to share a few slides and share a bit of data to set the stage and foundationally, set the stage for the discussion today. So Patrick, we'll give it up to you. Show us some of the data that you have to start the pricing discussion today.
Yeah, definitely, and appreciate that. And what I want to basically do, just for the audience, and also to give a good jumping off point for Kyle, Stelly, and myself, is just explain like what's going on in the world of SaaS and subscriptions right now. And this is happening outside of SaaS and subscriptions, but that's the data that we have, kind of exclusive access to. And the reason we have it is because through ProfitWell, we have about a third of the subscription world actually using that product at that point, which is thousands and thousands of companies. And that's kind of where we have some context here. So let me share my screen real quick. And my goal with these slides is, like I said before, just to kind of give you a little bit of a jumping off point, but ultimately to really kind of scare the crap out of you when it comes to pricing, mainly because a lot of us, and Stelly's been, hammering this home in his content. I know Kyle hammers this home in his content. We're running an old playbook in a world that is completely different. When we go out and we talk to founders, executives, and we actually ask them, hey, how many competitors that you had kind of in your first year of doing business, what we found is that those companies that are, really, really old, they didn't have a lot of competition. And those companies that are really, really new, they have a lot of competition. And the reason isn't necessarily because all of a sudden there's just, oh, this space is new and this space is great. The reason actually is because now software is easier and easier to build. So when we actually talk to these folks, those who started companies about 5 years ago, they were averaging about 3 competitors. And those companies that were started about a year ago, they're averaging about 10 competitors. And what's interesting is that's what gives us, MarTech landscape images that look like this. And actually the brand new one came out today. But this is why there's, 6,000 companies in marketing that are basically all telling you this is what we're going to do to help you grow, right? You didn't have all these companies 5, 6 years ago. And what's really fascinating about that is that competition isn't the problem. It's one of those things where there's a lot of ways you can outmaneuver competition. But unfortunately, what's happened is a lot of sales and marketing channels aren't rapidly growing anymore. If we were starting a company 10 years ago and we were somewhat clever and had somewhat large amounts of money or even small amounts of money, we could be the one who was first getting pay-per-clicks at a penny per click on Google. We could be the one who was getting 85% open rates on email because there just wasn't as much out there. And what's fascinating is when we ask these founders how many sales and marketing channels they were using in different years, they used to be using maybe 2, maybe 3 marketing and sales channels within their business. But over time, this has really, really leveled off. And it's mainly because we're not getting a new Facebook. We're not getting a new Google every single year. We're actually only getting one of those every 4 years or so right now. And so we have this scenario where all of a sudden there's more and more competition out there. There's a ton of product out there, and we don't have as many marketing and sales channels to acquire those customers. And what this has caused is that we as businesses, we've lost all of our power. We used to be able to do really, really well with pretty much being a little bit lazy and just having a little bit of cleverness. But now we've lost a lot of that power where customer acquisition costs has increased steadily because everyone's doing ebooks, everyone's doing pay-per-click ads, everyone's doing webinars. All of a sudden, CAC has increased pretty substantially. We've actually seen that customer 5 years ago who might have cost you $100 per acquisition is now actually costing you $150 to $160, mainly because there is so much density happening in the market. And all of a sudden, our old playbook of continuing to just want to acquire customers is starting to miss out. And what's also fascinating is that willingness to pay is actually declining pretty rapidly. So when we look at the relative value of features, this is the concept of, hey, we're going to make more money by adding this feature, adding this product. All of a sudden, it's just not working anymore. You used to be able to sell a closed.io integration inside your product for hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars, 4 or 5 years ago. But now that same integration is actually worth much less. Where even core features are being worth, basically 30% of what they once were. And this is pretty intuitive, right? Because, those features that we were building, 5 years ago that might have seemed like just magical features, they're kind of the bread and water of software now because there's just so much software out there. And so what's really, really interesting about this data, though, is that there's more competition. That means your CAC is higher. Willingness to pay has gone down. Software is become amazing, right? We can all probably agree that it's pretty objective to say that software is so much better today than it was 5 years ago, but consumers are extremely ungrateful. NPS has actually dropped pretty dramatically. So the average NPS score 5 years ago was about 34, and this is across B2B and B2C companies. And the average NPS today has actually dropped to 10. And NPS, for those of you who don't know, is a measure of customer satisfaction. But we're living in this world where basically everything's amazing and everyone's unhappy and everything's costing more. And it's pretty tough to live in this world right now. And unfortunately, we haven't really changed. And to kind of bring this home before we open it up for discussion, when we go out and we ask founders, executives, and we say, hey, what's the one important growth lever in your business? Is it acquisition? Is it monetization? Is it retention? All over the board, it says acquisition, acquisition, acquisition. Most of us just care about more logos. 7 out of 10 of us care about more logos. Very, very few of us care about how much money we're making per logo. And very, very few of us, care about actually keeping those customers around. And the problem with this, when we look at data, what we found is that acquisition is now table stakes. You need to be good at selling. You need to be good at marketing just to survive today. And when we actually isolate the impact of acquisition, monetization, and retention, we actually isolate those impacts and we compare them across the board. What we found is that a 1% improvement in your acquisition, meaning your sales volume or your sales conversion rate, it equates to about a 3% boost in your actual revenue and your bottom line. And that impact is actually declining over time. So all of a sudden, we're putting all of our eggs in this acquisition basket. And it's one of those things where you absolutely need to acquire customers, but it's not bringing us that growth that we need. And on the flip side, monetization and retention is actually super, super powerful, where if you improve your monetization by 1% or your retention by 1%, you're seeing really, really big gains over time. And so I'll pause there. I know that's a quick, rambly, really, really quick overview of what's going on in the market, but the bottom line is that monetization and retention has so much more effective impact on your growth right now, but we're putting all of our eggs in this acquisition basket, which is ultimately problematic as we want to continue to grow in this market that we're in now.
Holy shit. So this presentation leads, there's certain moments I'm sure that people are going to be slightly suicidal, right? Or overwhelmed. Okay.
My role is to make everyone feel bad.
There you go. That's not a bad motivator to take action, right? If you're sufficiently shocked and afraid, it might push you to take drastic action. I think that's not a bad thing for many companies and startups out there. But looking at this, right, especially, and we'll try to touch on this both on new companies that are just thinking about trying to figure out what their pricing should be, and maybe the more complicated case of companies that have been around for a while and are not sure if their pricing is correct. But if I look at this and I say, okay, so the marketplace is a lot more competitive than it used to be. Acquisition channels are a lot more competitive than they used to be. Quality of what people expect in terms of the software and the feature set and the design, UI, UX, is going up like crazy. So keeping customers satisfied is harder. If I look at all these things, how do I then, what's my strategy to compete as a new, somebody that's new and entering the market? And how do I decide where to price? Because here's something that I observed. I don't have a ton of data, so I might be wrong, or my worldview might be skewed or distorted. But what I observe a lot of times with new startups is when they try to figure out their pricing strategy, their number one goal is, let's come up with a pricing where pricing will never come up as a reason why people don't buy. Right? They try to put their pricing structure somewhere where it's so low that it feels comfortable to them, and it's not going to be an objection when they interact with customers. And to me, it's not a good strategy, right? For many reasons. We can get into that a little bit later. But I'm dying to hear, from both Kyle, I know that you guys with OpenView Partners, you talk to so many new ventures and help them on the pricing side, but also you, Patrick, with the insane amount of data that you have. What is the advice that we give to new startups when they're trying to come up with their first pricing model in general? Like, what strategy, what data, how should they go about even figuring out what the price should be and pricing tier should be for their product?
Totally. I can take this first. I mean, one of the things that I've learned is that pricing is not a competitive moat, right? By being the lowest price in the market, that's not a sustainable competitive advantage. That's not going to make a company attractive from a VC standpoint, from a kind of long-term sustainability standpoint. So you have to find what really is that secret sauce. And that comes from incorporating customer development and customer feedback early on. So you know that what you're designing solves a real pain point that produces economic value and ROI for your customers, and that it's something that they're willing to pay for. So it's not one of those things that's commoditized. Patrick's slide around willingness to pay for different features and how that's declined over time. You're finding something that's really unique, differentiated in a space where there's not a whole lot of competition, and there's really, a big relief for customers that you're doing this. So we're seeing more and more companies move and bring SaaS into worlds that, software never really was there. So vertical SaaS is, a big trend. And that's something where, we've been investing in companies that are increasingly kind of obscure, but software has never been in those spaces. People are using pen and paper, they're using Excel, they're using email, they're not using software to solve those problems. But by bringing in software that creates a lot of time savings, better quality, more revenue for their customers, and it's this differentiated solution. So I think that the biggest thing is starting from first principles and really taking value before building something, rather than building something and then keeping the price as low as possible.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that, I think that's huge, right? Because so many of us, and this is, when you were building a product like 5-10 years ago, you could very well just build something and then go find, where you should be. You didn't have to go back to those first principles because there was a lot of speed, right? And I think that the practical, like going one step down, one thing that we find really, really useful is especially if you're early on, getting a sense of who your buyer is and who your buyer personas are. Now, you can, HubSpot and Marketo and other companies, they've written decades of data, decades of publishing about like what buyer personas are. But what we found super, super useful, not only for your pricing in the early stage and even the late stage, but also for your overall kind of just alignment of your company, is quantifiably figuring out, am I selling to salespeople from this stage to this stage, this stage to this stage, and this stage to this stage? Or is it marketers, or is it just people who have less than 10 users, or is it just people who use Close.io, or just people who do this or that? Like, what are those actual buyers? Because most of the time, once you can figure that out, and there's a bunch of techniques on how to actually figure out willingness to pay and quantify these folks that Kyle's written about and I've written about, but those first principles of who that buyer is normally helps your pricing a lot, and it also just helps you like in your company in general.
Sweet. Yeah, I think that like understanding your customer better than the competition and defining your customer a bit, like back in the day, you might be able to be a bit broader with your niche definition and get away with it, right? You'd be like, we have this scheduling software for doctors, right? And then today there's a million of these. So now 2 years ago, you might have said, well, we do scheduling software for dentists. And today you might have to say, we do scheduling software for dentists that share an office with 3 other dentists and that are specialized on XYZ, right? And people always, like, I think a lot of entrepreneurs, we are nervous about being super niche in the beginning because we feel like that makes our company seem small and unattractive, especially to investors and the press and the outside world. But you can't go super broad in a market that's so competitive, right? Because you're not going to be able to figure out how to serve the customer better, how to market to that customer better, how to really do something just slightly more different, but so much more valuable to that type of a customer, especially when there's a segment that's like undervalued, right? Or not as noticed or not as fought for. These type of customers will benefit a lot from you existing and focusing on them, but also they'll reward you hopefully with retention and with brand loyalty and lots of other things. So let's quickly touch on another topic. Let's say that, let's stay on this for a little bit. So let's say we do the customer development work necessary. We try to figure out who our customer is, the ideal customer, what the niche is. From a practical point of view, oftentimes I have founders that ask me, well, okay, but how do I now know what the price should be, right? I have done all this work. I can't just ask them what they want to pay me. Or if I ask them, how do I know that they're going to be honest? I can't just put a price on a website because what if I have to change it? There's like some real fear about the practical points of like, how do you take that research and now put a price tag on what you're doing and how you're serving your customers? So what do you do once you have an idea who your ideal customer is and now you have to start putting a price tag behind things, right? And you're still a little bit unsure if the price tag is going to be right or wrong.
Yeah, so I can also start off, although Patrick can probably get even more scientific than me. I think what's interesting with pricing research is there is sort of a best-in-class standard, right? Like that you can get incredibly scientific about it. When I was doing consulting work at Simon Kucher, I would sometimes work with large Fortune 500 companies for a year and bring in all the scientific pricing techniques possible, but you don't need to. And it's actually starting small and getting some data points and confidence is a lot better than just flying blind when it comes to pricing. And I'll talk about how to do that. But just one comment to your point, Stelly, is that as VCs, we do look for a large market, right? So we are guilty of sort of encouraging startups to look at a large market size. But honestly, one of the very first things I work on with our new portfolio companies is identifying that ideal customer profile, because maybe they have 5-10 sales reps, a limited marketing budget. They're going after a $5 billion market size, and they're trying to target that entire market at once. They're just not going to get traction anywhere. And it's best to be really focused and find their specific niche, get way more efficient, dominate that market, get all the network effects and virality and all those great references, that great track record, build the product to really dominate in that space, and then go broader versus starting too broad, never getting any traction, and just sort of drowning in that competitive noise in the market. So I totally agree with that point. But on the pricing side, some of the techniques that I found work pretty well are, first off, doing customer interviews to try to gauge what is the ROI and the amount of pain that you're solving for the customer. So if you can track how long something takes, how long something might take if they use your software, what amount of revenue is at stake, how much pain are you really solving for? You can take a portion of that pain, a portion of that ROI that you're driving for the customer as your contribution, your portion of the revenue. So that's good for sort of t-shirt sizing where you can be ballpark wise. Another area is bringing in pricing questions when you talk to customers. That's something people are really hesitant of doing. But as you're doing product feedback, customer development, interviews, asking things like what price do you think that it would be a real bargain for the solution? At what price would this be getting expensive? What price would this be too expensive for you to even consider? When you ask those questions, you start to see what are the expectations in the market. And for better or worse, those are the things that you're going to run up against in the deal, or your sales team is going to run up against. So it's better to at least know that going in. You don't need to be completely wedded to what the customer tells you. And if people say to kind of lean towards more of what price they consider expensive, because they might lowball you a little bit when they tell you the price, but that'll at least give you a sort of a guide rail for where you should be and where the customer's expecting. But Patrick, I'm sure you can chime in with a lot more tips around optimizing pricing.
Yeah, I mean, that was great. I think I think the biggest thing, and I might be channeling Stelly when I say this, I'm not going to yell though. But the biggest thing in terms of like getting pricing research is you just have to do it. And I think that a lot of people, they sit back and some of the excuses Stelly said and some of the comments that Kyle made, where it's just like, oh, I can't ask them. Oh, maybe it's not going to be enough. Maybe it's this. How do I ask them? All these different things. There's tons of techniques out there. Depending on what you're trying to do, you just have to start. And I typically recommend A/B testing is probably one of the worst things that you can do to test your pricing. And the main reason for that is because most of us have nowhere near enough traffic to truly test even an A/B test, let alone your packaging, your positioning, and all these different things. And so you really have to start small with that customer profile that Kyle was talking about, that I alluded to before as well. And then when you actually go into looking at the different pieces of that profile, you have to talk to your customers. And the way that we recommend doing that is first starting out exactly what Kyle said, having those conversations qualitatively, and don't ask them how much you're willing to pay. That's not a question that is easy to answer for anyone. And especially if you're approaching them kind of on a one-on-one, they can get kind of put off by that question. Instead, we can take advantage of how people think about value. So human beings, and psychologists and economists have studied this for years, they think about value as a spectrum. So we know that this bottle of water is less expensive than this computer. We just naturally know that because we get more utility and more value out of the computer than we do with that bottle of water. And so what's interesting is you can take advantage of that by asking questions that Kyle was alluding to, such as, at what point is it way too expensive that you'd never consider purchasing it? At what point is it a really good deal that you'll sign the contract today? And when you start to ask those qualitatively, even if you get 10, 20 responses, which is nowhere near statistically significant, but at least you started that path of, okay, we're not $1,000 product. We're not a $10,000 product. We're a $50 product. Or maybe we are a $100 product, but you can start to get in those answers. And then as you collect more and more data, there's some statistical models that you can use using those exact same questions to get price elasticity and things like that. But that's kind of like that's the next step. That's after you've, done a little bit of your own qualitative research, then you would want to quantify it.
I love it. Yeah. So, I mean, the one thing I want to double click on is you need to be okay with getting it wrong. And it's not the end of the world, right? You need to put yourself out there, try some things. Just because you set your pricing doesn't mean you can never increase it or decrease it. People think pricing is a thing that once you set it, it's locked for eternity, and like the natural laws of the universe, stop you from being able to. No, like you can change things. You need to, at some point, jump off the cliff without having all the data and all the certainty that what you've got is perfect, and be okay with the idea that you might have to change things, right?
Really. It's a muscle that you build to that point. If you never change pricing, you never build that muscle for optimizing pricing, understanding value. And so if it becomes an exercise you do every 3 or 4 years, you don't have that muscle memory and ability as a company to really grow and learn thinking about value and value-based pricing.
Yeah. And
the other thing.
Go ahead, Patrick.
Oh, I was just going to say something on that note as well, is like, and I just saw this in the chat, so I don't want to pick on anyone, but like a huge common excuse to talking to your customers is exactly what I just read in chat, which is, well, they're not going to pay what they say, right? And I think the thing is like what I have found is this is an excuse for movement, because in reality, your customers, if you ask the right questions, and the right questions are along the lines that I mentioned and Kyle was mentioning, of asking in ranges and doing that across a group of folks, you're not going to get a pinpoint 100% accuracy, but if you do it right, you can actually get within a reasonable range of what reality actually looks like. And normally when people say they're never going to actually tell you what it is, it's an indication of, one, someone who's never tried, and then two, someone who doesn't necessarily know that you can actually get super, super accurate. So the common Van Westendorp technique that's been written about a lot, and it's kind of it's a little clunky. You can actually get pretty good accuracy of plus or minus 20 to 25%. At least that's what we found. That's not great, but it's something, right? And if you make it more complicated, which you can get to about plus or minus 3 to 5%. If you want to kind of go that far. But I think it's one of those things where you just have to talk to the customer, and it's an excuse not to. And it's more, looking inward. It's probably because you don't want to have that conversation because it's a little bit uncomfortable, rather than actually wanting to get the data and iterate. And the last thing I'll say, just to reiterate exactly what Kyle said, which is, you got to get that muscle memory going, because your price is the exchange rate on the value that you're providing. If your software improves, if your brand improves, if your case studies improve, all of these different things, your price has got to improve as well. And the most successful companies that we've seen from a data perspective are changing their pricing in some way, not necessarily raising their prices, but they're changing something at least once every 6 months. And most of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, we probably haven't changed our prices in, years, if not longer.
Yep. So I really want to underscore this, the whole pricing itself is a product that needs to be constantly developed, reevaluated, because it's not just your product and company and brand changing. The market is changing. Your customers are changing. So the value you create for them might be increasing or decreasing. Like the world is changing, so your price can't be static. And I'm saying this as much to hear it myself than I'm telling it to people that are listening here. So I think that's a huge learning, a really important attitude test. So we've gotten some really amazing questions. I want to keep encouraging everybody to ask your questions. Click the Q&A button. Soon we're going to get into the Q&A session, but I still have control over this webinar, and I have a few things that I'm curious about. So 2 things that I really want to touch on. One, and this is very very intimate, near to our heart at Close, is that I want to ask about your guys' opinion on, I don't know how to call this, like price intransparency or the bait and switch of pricing. So in many ways, when we priced Close, we were a little naive, not with we were never cheap, right? We were very confident who we were serving, how much value we were creating. So we priced our product accordingly, and we succeeded with that. But one thing that we were very naive about was that some things just seemed natural and fair to us that nobody else was doing. So, we did these things from the get-go, kind of like treat others how you want to be treated. And it took a long time and a lot of data to admit to ourselves that customers really didn't give a fuck, right? Like that honesty in some cases was not really rewarded with a lot more loyalty or even with appreciation, because people would just forget. I'll give you a great example of this: mix and match pricing, right? So we're the only player in our market where if you have 10 users, you can select, out of our 3 main pricing plans, you can select which user is going to be on which plan, and you don't have to have all users on the highest plan that you want to have in terms of functionality. And to us, it's always seemed like the right thing to do, the fair thing to do. It didn't seem that revolutionary. But what we've come to understand by serving a lot of our customers and by paying a lot of attention is that people would never really realize that up front. Like even when we try to advertise it on the website, it didn't never really register. When we would tell people about this, they would go, "Oh, that's very nice of you. That's really great." But a year later, 6 months later, when we would ask them, they would have forgotten already. And when we told them again, "Hey, when you compare our pricing with our competitors, here's how it would pan out if you think about mix and match versus not," they would be like, "Oh yeah, I can mix and match with you guys. Did we take advantage of this?" Like people were completely oblivious of that fact. And this is just one example. There's so many examples where our competitors trick customers into things where, the price tag they quote you today is X. But once you really want to use the product 6 months later, you realize it's X plus a really big margin. And a lot of times, part of the genius of that is that once somebody is customer for 3, 4, 5 months and they've invested all that and been increasing in price, they now have this lock-in where a customer will tell us, "I really hate how they baited me into paying that much money, but now that I've paid so much money, even when I'm unhappy, I don't feel like I can leave. Right now, I'm kind of committed to this. I need to make this work," which is genius, right? So I want to talk a little bit about that with you guys in terms of, what we think is fair and honest and good, but what have been proven as like best practices, and like how transparent should you really be with your pricing? How fair and how fair or unfair do you make the competition then that might be advertising a price that's much lower than where customers are going to end up when they're using it? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts and what you see in the market happening.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I could start off, but it's tough to answer that. So, I think if I look at things from the big picture, right? Big picture is that things are moving in the direction of transparency, and it's easier and easier as a buyer to find information out online. There's more third-party review sites, G2 Crowd, Capterra. There's tons and tons of those now. And it's increasingly easy to sort of call a friend, a colleague, send a message on LinkedIn and find out, what other people are paying, what their experience is. And in that world of transparency and information, SaaS vendors are going to be held to a higher standard in terms of transparency and trust with their customers. Because